that was supported by the United Nations Global Compact Prime, or Principles for Responsible Management Education, to develop a series of giving voice to value style cases and curricula and teaching notes around anti-corruption, created or crafted and written by Indian business school faculty about situations in India. And that was very exciting, trying to find these amazing examples of private sector actors and some public sector actors who had really done some impressive things to try and address corruption. I'm also a member of the United Nations Global Compact Prime Faculty Working Group on Anti-Corruption. What is exciting to me about today is that although my work has largely been focused on the private sector, it has focused more on issues around bribery, and I'm really interested in expanding and learning some more about our topics today. I know that the topic of combating illicit trade, and within it human trafficking, is critical to our economy and to our security globally. Human trafficking affects all industries on a global scale, and currently there are many promising practices to address this challenge that are resulting from movements created from within the various sectors, whether through corporate leaders, consumers, academia, and non-governmental organizations. And I think we'll hear about some of those today. During today's conversation, and as the start of this webinar series that Christina described, we'll discuss some key initiatives that are emerging within and in partnership with the private sector. That's why I'm so excited about this. We welcome 3 speakers today who represent a range of perspectives, and each of them will present briefly. After their individual presentations, we'll have a discussion which will be based on your questions as the global audience. So as soon as the first presenter begins speaking, and while the other speakers present as well, we ask you to please send your own questions as they come to you. You can send them through the chat box mechanism, which is on the lower right-hand side of your screen. You simply type in your question in the chat box and make sure it's addressed to everyone. And then Christina and I will be sharing those questions during the discussion period after our speakers. We'll collect them and begin the discussion after the last presenter. This discussion will be recorded, and we'll be sending out the recording through our network at the Global Initiative and Babson College for those who are not able to participate today. So now I'd like to move on to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Illicit. Can we move to, oh, we have his slide, great. So Illicit is the Chief of Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling Section of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. In that role, he coordinates all policy and technical assistance to UN member states in combating these crimes. He's a national of Greece and a qualified lawyer, and he's held a number of senior legal positions within the UNODC, as well as other international organizations, including in the Terrorism Prevention Branch and Anti-Organized Crime Unit. He has served as director of the Secretariat Against Organized Crime for Southeast Europe, has been head of OSCE Rule of Law and Human Rights Department in Serbia and Montenegro, and a senior legal advisor to the International Supervisor for BRECO, Bosnia and Herzegovina, advising on all legal and policy issues related to the implementation of the Dayton Peace Accords. He holds a master's degree on war studies from the University of London and a law degree from the University of Athens, and we're really honored to have him here today. Again, Illicit will begin speaking now, and I remind the audience as you listen to him, if you have questions, to chat them in so that we will have them for the further discussion. So, Illicit, to you.
Mary, hi, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to your audience today, and also for the nice words. I promise next time I'll send you a couple of lines for Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's okay. We can hear you.
I was just thanking Mary for the opportunity, and also Christina and the organizers for the opportunity to speak to your audience today. I'm very glad to be part of, a distinguished list of speakers, some of which I know quite well. So I'm very happy to be part of the group. Now, UNODC is the guardian of the first international instrument that defines human trafficking in a comprehensive manner. the protocol to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. The job of my section is to provide technical assistance to all member states, to all UN member states, to implement the protocol. And in that work, we do work also a lot with the civil society, as well with the private sector. My presentation will basically try to put in a different framework, the framework we work in the discussion. So we'll be talking about the international framework. I will be very briefly explaining the role that we have and the global situation in relation to trafficking in persons, and then I specifically mention the work that we do with the private sector, and I promise to do all of this in less than 10 minutes. Now, the protocol. The protocol has the first internationally recognized definition of human trafficking. And as you can see from the slide, it's a rather complicated, legally complicated definition, which does not make our life easy, and it does not make definitely the life of our member states easy. It's a crime that is complicated to investigate. It's a crime complicated to prove, and much more difficult to get a solid case to court. This, of course, has a ripple effect on the challenges that we face, that member states face, in developing any kind of prevention strategies for this type of crime, and of course, this affects the private sector. Now, I need to say that the protocol has been endorsed, has been engulfed, has been ratified, as we say in our jargon, by a large number of member states. We have 193 member states. You see that 163 of them have already ratified the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. However, I need to say that despite the high level of ratifications and the high level of criminalization, there are a lot to be done with regard to criminalization, to the implementation of the laws. There will be a new global report on human trafficking issued by the United Nations, by our own office in November this year, which will provide an overview of the situation around our member state, around the world. And I cannot reveal yet the data because the report will be publicly launched at the month of November, but I can refer to some of the figures that we used in previous reports, which I think will remain more or less the same. We see, and I will use the next slide, that sexual exploitation remains the predominant form of the purpose of exploitation reported by member states. We do see, though, a large increase of reported cases of forced labor. And this also has an impact on the number of victims that are identified, because forced labor is largely associated also with men and boys as victims rather than women and girls, which are usually the largest majority of victims for the purposes of sexual exploitation. Women and girls do remain the largest part of the victims identified around the world. And with regard to the types of exploitation, sex exploitation is most frequently detected in Europe and Central Asia. Labor exploitation is mostly detected in Africa and the Middle East. I need also to say that, under the protocol, the different forms of exploitation referred to, the list is not closed. It's not a closed number of forms of exploitation. So member states report different types of exploitation. We have also forced marriage, forced begging, illegal adoption for certain purposes. With regard to the private sector, I think it relates mostly to the purpose of forced labor as a purpose of exploitation. However, I need to say that there is also a private sector engagement in cases of trafficking for the purpose of organ removal, where in this case you may have medical staff being involved, you may have insurance companies, travel agencies. So this is the second type of exploitation that I think is prevalent to our discussion today. Now, what do we do with the private sector? I have categorized it in three groups. The first group is understanding the impact that the private sector can have on human trafficking. And I'm referring here to three of the ongoing initiatives that we have. The first is to understand the impact that recruitment fees that some of the recruitment agencies charge on employees to find them a job somewhere else, usually abroad, in creating vulnerabilities that could lead to human trafficking. This is a practice very, very widely used in some parts of the world, especially the Gulf region, and but also elsewhere. And it has been quite of concern to us because we feel that it may create vulnerabilities because the employees would immediately have a large debt to repay before they even start, you know, the work. We're working closely with ILO on the implementation of this project, and we hope to be able to produce an analysis of the situation within the first quarter of 2015. The second one is the trafficking in purpose trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal. And here we have undergone a quite thorough study over 2 years with 2 international expert group meetings, trying to understand exactly what is the involvement of what could the involvement of the private sector be in these cases and how this can be prevented. Finally, the fishing industry has been one of the industries that has been the focus of a lot of concerns with regard to practices. The fact that fishing fleets may be operating in the high seas, sometimes under flags of opportunity, create certain conditions that make it difficult for member states to basically investigate and prosecute cases and even detect cases of human trafficking on such occasions. Second group of activities is working with the private sector to increase awareness within the private sector about human trafficking. And there are 2 initiatives that I would like to mention here, which have undertaken under UN GIFT. The first is the Business Leaders Award. This was a partnership with an NGO that we have developed, and according to which we have been awarding, if you like, acknowledging the job that senior executives in companies have done in creating awareness within the chain, the supply chains usually, on how to best combat human trafficking. It has been a quite visible process with a lot of applications coming in from major companies. We hope to be able to continue. There has been 1 award given in 2010 and the second one in 2012. The second one is the e-learning tool, and Livia has been working extensively on it. This is an online tool for training purposes that companies can use for the staff to basically train them on what human trafficking is and how certain practices should be, how can I say, carefully monitored, especially again within the supply chain of large companies. The third area is the support we receive from the private sector to increase global awareness on human trafficking. And here I have 3 examples to use. The first is the General Assembly Trust Fund to support victims of human trafficking. This is a trust fund that awards grants to NGOs to basically deliver direct assistance to victims of human trafficking. It has a very large cooperation with the private sector. We receive a lot of direct financial support, as well as events that are sponsored by the private sector can lead to financing for the trust fund. So we're very thankful to the companies that are working with us on this. The second one is the Blue Hat campaign. This is a global campaign of my office to basically raise awareness. It's usually endorsed by the governments, but we are also allowing companies to use it in cooperation with us to basically support fundraising efforts, especially for the trust fund. There's a growing number of countries that have endorsed the Blue Hat campaign, and I'm looking at the map now: Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Nigeria in Africa, India in South Asia, Romania, and hopefully soon Moldova in Europe. Finally, we have a unique case law database for human trafficking cases. We have more than close to 1,200 cases from 88 different jurisdictions. And here, for example, a lot of companies, and I'm talking about law firms, for example, do a lot of pro bono work in researching for such cases in the catastrophes of courts around the world, and provide us with summaries, provide us with analysis. And this is an extremely useful tool because we use it for all the research that we do to understand better how the crime manifests itself in different parts of the world and how the member states are dealing with it. I will stop here. I hope I stay within my time limits. I just wanted to give you a very broad overview of what we do. I think there's a lot of room to do more things with the private sector. Of course, the main responsibility falls on governments to try to provide their agencies with the right tools to investigate and prosecute this crime, but prevention is a hugely important element. I think the private sector has a lot of contributions to make in that effort. Thank you.
Mayan?
Yes.
Thank you, Ilias. This is Mary again. That was a really helpful overview, and I think it helps put our conversation in context. And I want to remind everyone, if you had questions for Ilias while he was speaking, to make sure you're chatting them in on your screens. I'm going to introduce our second speaker now, Quinn Kepes, who's the Program Director for Verite. I encourage you to do the same thing, chat in your questions while Quinn is speaking. Let me do a brief introduction here for Quinn. Thank you for being with us. Quinn is, as I said, the Program Director for Verite. In that role, he provides objective, actionable research to government institutions, to businesses, to pension funds, NGOs, academics, and individual consumers that accurately informs decisions on policies, sourcing, investments, and purchasing, which all encourage respect for labor rights. He oversees Verite's annual Emerging Markets Research Program, under which he supervises the work of field researchers in 25 focal countries for the New York City Employees Retirement System. He manages Verite's research project for the U.S. Department of Labor on the causal factors of forced labor, as well as on the formulation of policy recommendations to combat this phenomenon in 7 countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. He's also research manager to determine the ways in which Nepalese immigrants are trafficked to India, Israel, Malaysia, the United Arab Emirates, and the U.S. And finally, he supervises the work on Verite's Labor Law Digest, their country labor standards compliance assessment, and other individual research projects for businesses and pension funds. All sound like very useful resources. So I'd like to turn this the floor over to Quinn now. And again, don't forget to chat in your questions.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to talk today. I'm going to be giving a presentation on understanding and addressing risks of human trafficking in business operations. So Verite is an international organization or an international NGO headquartered in Massachusetts in the United States, and we provide knowledge and tools to businesses, governments, workers, and civil society to eliminate the most serious labor and human rights abuses in global supply chains. And generally, we do focus on issues such as labor trafficking, forced labor, and extreme health and safety violations. And as you can see, we work with a large number of prominent international companies across a large number of sectors and industries, and have been working for about 20 years now on these types of issues. I've personally been working on trafficking for about 7 years now with Verite in a large number of sectors and countries. My biggest focus on Latin America. We've conducted research for foundations and government institutions on labor trafficking in a large number of sectors. And so here are listed some of the sectors in which we've done research. Fishing also isn't on there, but that's another sector that we've recently done some research in as well. And so, of course, trafficking is not limited to these industries, and more as we continue to do research, we find trafficking in sectors not mentioned here or in which it was not previously discovered. And so some of the first research we did was actually in U.S. agriculture on forced labor, and found that actually guest workers on visas were more vulnerable to forced labor than workers who'd come in as undocumented immigrants. And this is the quote here is from one guest worker who I interviewed in Colorado, actually, who was brought in on a 3-year special visa to work as a cattle herder. And basically, he wasn't given any money. His return ticket was taken away. His passport was taken away. He was physically isolated on a ranch and threatened if he was to leave. And this was a Chilean migrant from Patagonia. And so he was finally able to save up enough gasoline for a tractor mower to run away. And so you know, these are sort of industries in which there hasn't been much attention, and generally everywhere we start to scratch the surface and begin to dig deeper, we find trafficking in a number of different countries and settings. And so we've done research for Humanity United in a lot of different sectors, as well as the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of State. Recently released a report for the U.S. Department of Labor on forced labor in the Malaysian electronics sector as well. And so as part of our research, we've developed red flags for trafficking, you know, which are based both on the Palermo Protocol and then the ILO indicators of forced labor. And we try to sort of have developed a set of indicators that were relevant and understandable for businesses. And so, you know, part of this is setting the stage, or sort of the structural factors that can contribute to vulnerability to trafficking. And so whether that's a large number of migrant workers at a work site, recruitment and management of workers by labor brokers, the length of the recruitment supply chain, and then also if we found that low recruitment fees for employers generally mean that workers are paying very high recruitment fees. And then also the use of contract guest workers, and especially in programs that lack visa portability, meaning that there's really an inherent menace of penalty of deportation if a worker changes jobs or employers, even if those employers are violating their labor rights or the provisions of their contract. And then there's the bait, right, which is what happens during recruitment and hiring. And that can be anything from high entrance fees to high interest on debt, contract substitutions or changes, fraudulent visa practices, and deception about the type of the job, location, salary, length of the contract. And then the switch is really what happens on the job. So whether that's a broker as a manager of workers, whether that's passport confiscation, deductions, or very low pay, control of workers' bank accounts, penalties for breaking contracts, isolation, whether that's physical or social, and then threats and violence. And many times doing research in Guatemala or in the Amazonian region of Peru, we find that, you know, in areas where violence is pervasive and there's a high level of impunity, even very implicit threats can be a real factor that holds workers in forced labor. We've also done a lot of research on labor brokers and recruitment fees, and are actually working with UNDC at the moment on a project linking recruitment practices and recruitment fees to labor trafficking. And we found that through our audits, we do a lot of audits for some of the companies that we mentioned, as well as research in a large number of countries. We found, for example, taking samples of workers from Southeast Asian countries, that the average number of months that foreign workers have to work in order just to pay off recruitment and job placement fees ranges from 19 months in Indonesia, 18 months in the Philippines, 15 months workers from Thailand, and then 21 months for workers from Vietnam. And so this is, again, just to pay off the recruitment fees, and this is a factor that binds workers to their employers. They really would not be able to earn enough in their countries of origin in order to pay those off. And so, you know, that coupled with widespread passport confiscation, for example, really contributes to a situation with a very high vulnerability to forced labor. And so, of course, there are a lot of risks to workers in this type of scenario, but this also presents risks to companies. And so whether that's reputational risk, especially in this environment where brand image is so important, you know, when a company is tainted by a scandal, this can present a really big risk to the reputation, and of course, that can affect the bottom line. It can affect purchasers and consumers' decisions, and it can also affect stock prices, result in stockholder action, and can also result even in financial sanctions for violating laws. And so more and more there is a trend towards to increase legislation on trafficking. And so whether we're looking at the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, or actually a new law that just got passed in California regulating foreign labor recruiters, or it's the executive order strengthening protections against trafficking. Both of these require that businesses with over a certain amount of revenue institute programs to combat trafficking. And in the California example, they have to disclose the types of initiatives that are in place. And in the executive order example, they actually have to develop compliance plans to prevent trafficking in their supply chains. And we're actually working with the Department of State at the moment to develop both research looking at risk across industry sectors and countries, and then also developing model compliance plans for companies to come into compliance with this executive order. And there's also a trend, and Verite's done research on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the link between corruption and trafficking. And also the risk that companies, including top executives, can face, whether that's financial sanctions and jail time for actions committed by company representatives overseas. And so that involves both the movement of people, whether that's you know, bribes facilitating the provision of visas, or it can also be the movement of goods. For example, in Peru, where I did research on forced labor and illegal gold mining, a lot of times corruption and bribery facilitate the laundering of gold that is then exported to Switzerland or to the United States and makes its way into the supply chains of major companies. And you know, also in that vein, there is a lot of involvement of organized crime, again in the movement of people and goods. And so whether that's Mara Salvatrucha or the Zetas involvement in human smuggling, or whether that's something like Sendero Luminoso or Italian, Russian, and Chinese organized crime involved in illegal gold mining in Peru, there are organized crime entities listed on these lists with which companies are prohibited from doing business, and by employing workers that are moved by these organizations or purchasing goods, whether that's gold from illegal gold mines in Peru or avocados or iron from Michoacan. This is another way that companies can face legal risks. And so a lot of companies, sort of in the face of this, they may feel like they're at a loss of what to do. But there really are concrete steps that companies can take. And so one of the first ones is really mapping out risk, right? Finding where the hotspots for risk are. And again, Verite is developing a matrix that will allow companies to look at risk of trafficking in their supply chains based upon both geography and sectors in which they operate. And then it's really important to really understand who their suppliers and brokers are and where in each country they're operating, right? You know, again, the Peruvian example, depending upon where they're sourcing gold from, there are different risks by region. And so it's important to take, once you understand the main geography, take a deeper dive and really understand the actors that you are involved in. The next step is really to adopt the right policies. And again, we found that recruitment and labor brokers really are one of the main intervention points. And so two policies that we've seen that have a big impact are one, a policy of no fees for recruitment, that basically taking the stance that workers should not have to pay for their jobs. Another one is prohibiting the withholding of identification documents. This is another factor that really binds workers to their employer, and it's very prevalent in a number of industries and countries. We found a large percentage of workers in certain countries whose passports are routinely confiscated upon arrival. Then it's very important to build the capacity of all both within companies, whether that's of management, different departments, not just the CSR department, right? The individuals responsible for sourcing decisions also have to have knowledge of human trafficking and the impact of sourcing decisions on increasing vulnerability to trafficking. Suppliers, brokers, and buyers also need to be aware of these different vulnerabilities to trafficking, as well as the company's expectations for them. And then finally, it's really important to hold all the actors accountable. And so the first big part is through focused assessments. And we don't even like to use the word audits in many cases because audits, in many cases are just checklists. And so, they might be a check, is there forced labor or not? And so it's really important to dive a lot deeper. Speaking with workers is extremely important. You need to know if they paid for to get their job, if there's been any threats, if they're in debt, if they have their identification documents. And that can only really be done by talking to workers and carrying out very in-depth assessments. And then it's really important that workers are provided with grievance mechanisms, that they are ensured that their grievances will be confidential and there will be no reprisals. And this can really help companies. We've worked with companies in the U.S. agricultural sector as well as in China. Developing grievance mechanisms that will allow workers to report back to the brand on the practices that are happening at the supplier level. And that, again, ensures that workers are protected and also protects the brand from reputational or financial or legal risk. And then it's important to have internal collaboration. So whether that's within departments, again, between CSR and supplier programs and sourcing decisions, or whether that's between the brand and its suppliers and brokers. It's important to have that type of collaboration. And this type of collaboration and these stances really can have an impact. We've been working extensively with Apple, and Apple took a stance that workers should not have to pay more than 1 month's net wages for recruitment. As you can see, a lot of times they're paying up to 21 months of wages. And this has had a huge impact. They required that their suppliers reimburse any fees in excess of 1 month's wages to workers, and beginning in 2008 through 2013, $13.1 million were reimbursed to contract workers. In 2012 alone, there were $6.4 million that were reimbursed to contract workers. In the electronics sector specifically, a lot of companies are moving towards no-fee recruitment, and very soon we will see those types of practices in place. Again, this is just one company, and there's a need to expand this to other industries as well. And Verite has developed different tools for companies on recruitment and labor brokerage and the risk of forced labor linked to both of those. And so we have the Resources for Responsible Recruitment site, which focuses on the issues, existing efforts, and initiatives, and provides companies with resources that they can use to really diminish the risk of trafficking in their supply chains linked to recruitment. We also have a Help Wanted toolkit. This includes both research, some of which I mentioned, on the link between labor brokerage and forced labor, as well as specific tools for brands, suppliers, governments, advocates, investors, auditors, and multi-stakeholder initiatives to combat the risk of trafficking in supply chains linked to labor brokerage and recruitment practices. So thank you again for giving me the time to speak, and I'm always happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Quinn. That was really, really informative. So we're now going to turn to our third and final speaker, Steve GI-TOC, who's a member of the Order of the British Empire, the founder and CEO of Stop the Traffic. He's an author, speaker, TV and radio presenter, businessman, social entrepreneur, husband and father, and began his public life as a Baptist minister. He founded the Oasis Charitable Trust, which pioneers life-transforming housing, healthcare, education, church, youth, and community initiatives in the UK and globally. He started Oasis Church, Waterloo, in central London, and is currently the senior minister there, and it's the first of a new network of UK churches. He founded Oasis Community Learning in 2005, which has opened 43 academy schools around the United Kingdom. And he founded Stop the Traffic in 2007. This is a global coalition working in nearly 100 countries with tens of thousands of activists around the world. It campaigns to end people trafficking through preventing the sale of human beings, prosecuting the traffickers, and protecting the victims. He's also a UN Gift Special Advisor for the Community Action Against Human Trafficking. I want to again remind folks to please chat in their questions while Steve is speaking, and when he's finished, we'll open the discussion for all our speakers to address the questions that you've shared. Thank you. Steve?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm now the presenter. Is my PowerPoint just going to pop up, or do I need to do that? Yeah?
That's it.
Okay. I'm not sure that I know how to change the PowerPoint slides.
Just up at the top of the screen, you'll see arrows to the left, those bubbles. That'll control the slides for everyone.
Okay. Okay. I think I may have got it, I may not have got it. But anyway, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Chalk, as you just heard, and I'm here talking this afternoon, I guess, this afternoon in the UK, because of the Stop the Traffic. You've just heard that it's part of the voluntary sector. It was founded in 2005. It was founded out of some of the other work that the Oasis Trust is involved in, where we run schools in lots of other countries besides the UK. We have about 25,000 children of all ages in our schools in the UK, but work in a whole number of other countries around the world, in Asia, in Africa. And slowly we became aware that as we ran schools in slum communities, children would disappear. Our understanding was that parents would often send their child begging or put them to work rather than allow them into school for education. But as time went by, we slowly became aware that this possibly wasn't the whole truth. And that led us to some research which showed us that many of the children that were leaving us simply because they'd been trafficked. They disappeared. So Stop the Traffic was set up in 2005, and as you've just heard, we now work and offer services in actually 96 countries around the world. That's where we partner with other charities, other NGOs, other community groups that are working in terms of ending human trafficking. But we have offices in 11 countries around the world and a whole number of partnerships with UN agencies. So, for instance, I'm just back from Kyrgyzstan, where we're developing quite an in-depth relationship with UNICEF, where child trafficking is a huge issue. I'm going to move on the slide, but I'm still not sure I can find this arrow. I pressed an arrow, nothing seems to be happening. In fact, it's the only arrow on my screen, and nothing happens at all. I don't know if anybody else can.
Try using just your right arrow key on your keyboard. That should adjust.
Yeah, no, I'm doing that, and I'm hitting the arrow.
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Nothing's moving. There you go, half of it. Can you see that? It should say prevention. Stop the Traffic's committed to the prevention of trafficking, and developing system-wide answers to that. So we work with something approaching 2,500 small, large NGOs. Many of them are involved in developing safe houses. They have developed projects that work in red light districts. They are working with people in forced labor. But Stop the Traffic's task is simply to equip them with resources, to equip them with tools, to equip them with information and networks to get their job done. So one of the campaigns that we've been involved in since 2007 is looking at the situation which I guess most of you know around the problem of forced labour in the production of cocoa, and particularly, as we all know, this is true in Côte d'Ivoire. So we've worked to produce resources. This is just a for instance for charities, NGOs, community groups around the world, so that they can educate, so that they can campaign together. And the reason I show you the example of chocolate is this next slide. Cadbury's is a big brand in many countries around the world. Whoops, it's switched back again. Cadbury's is a big brand in many countries around the world, UK, New Zealand, Australia, etc., some of the big chocolate-eating countries. And this, before we started campaigning, was a bar of Cadbury's dairy milk. Cadbury's dairy milk is their core product. We campaigned. We got thousands of grassroots community groups campaigning around this issue, and this is what a bar of dairy milk chocolate looks like now. You notice the fair trade sign in the corner. It was 3 years ago that after a long struggle and after a huge campaign from community activists in many locations around the world, that Cadbury's eventually conceded that they would ensure that the cocoa they used in their staple brand dairy milk would be fairly traded. We've gone on to have many more successes, or I should say the endless community groups that we link together have gone on to have many more successes with Mars and Galaxy and Nestle, and we're working with Mondelez, who now own Cadbury's, across the number of brands that they own. Chocolate was one. I'm sorry, this prevention, it must be the screen size change that makes it more difficult. But chocolate's one thing. We're working with a whole number of corporates working in the cotton industry now. The emphasis always on prevention. This next shot is a gift box. As in being introduced, you said that I've worked as an advisor, special advisor to UN GIFT, the Global Initiative Fighting Trafficking, which itself is soon to be subsumed into other things. But for the London Olympics, for a number of the UN agencies that we were working with, who were looking for a presence at the London Olympics, we developed this gift box. Looks like a huge gift that's fallen out of the sky. We developed lots of these. They were placed around the London Olympics in 2012, and we had over 500,000 visitors. We had a whole number of people who were trafficked and living in London. From the outside, it looks like a gift. From the inside, it tells the stories of people who were trafficked through London. As I say, we had 500,000 visitors. We worked with the London police. We were able to identify several trafficking rings. We trained almost 500 volunteers from NGOs and community groups to staff these boxes. And now the idea of the box and the education, which is all about prevention, has spread around the world. Here's one in New York. This was installed for the Super Bowl there. We are using these boxes now around the world. Most recently, internationally, a growth into Brazil for the World Cup, where there were some boxes. I think this was in London, not in Brazil, but these are some members of the public just looking around. It's incredible that how powerful this tool is in finding new activists, in education, in receiving information, and that information being able to be used by the voluntary sector and by law enforcement agencies in terms of the work they're doing in that community. As I say, the number of countries using this very kind of visual art form that attracts people and tells them stories growing. It's growing fast, actually, and for the Olympics in Brazil in 2 years' time, just under 2 years' time now, these boxes are going to be across the nation, which is really a wonderful development. Again, our goal is always prevention. nothing but prevention. We know that for every safe house there is, and we're really glad that safe houses are set up, for every person that's rescued from a situation of forced labor or being trafficked, actually there'll be 10 more to take their place. So we have to tackle the system at root, which moves me on to just another example of something that we're involved in. We've been working on this for several years now, and it comes out of the 96 countries we're involved in, the educational resources that we offer there, the feedback we get, and particularly from the gift box project around the world. The feedback we got from so many agencies and law enforcement agencies working in countries as far away as the UK and Australia, New York, etc., working alongside the SOCA and now the National Crimes Agency here in the UK very closely, is that there is no reliable source of information as far as these groups are concerned, that's global, that tells the growing story and an accurate story about the numbers of people who are being trafficked, about the circumstances of that trafficking. I'm sure we'd all agree on this call that you know, we hear I speak at so many events where I hear people, sometimes law enforcement agencies, talk about the numbers of people that are trafficked, the numbers of people that are trafficked a day, the kinds of trafficking, the way that traffickers work. And of course, these are all snapshots, and some of it's accurate, and some of it simply because the presenter Googles their information from somebody else who said it earlier that year or last year. And so numbers of people that are trafficked and profits that traffickers are earning become folklore rather than any form of accuracy. So working with a number of big corporates, I've just visited New York in the development of this product, and working with Zeco, who are one of the biggest developers of apps in the world, working with companies such as IBM and Citibank, etc., etc. We're reaching a place where we think that early next year we're going to be able to launch an app which will be available on all platforms of smartphones, and it will allow, we aim to have 20 million users in the first year. We already have well over 1 million people actively involved with us in community groups around the world. By actively, I mean we don't just have their name, but they're feeding in information and they're working with Stop the Traffic around the world. What we want to do is through this app and of course the software systems and the analysis that sits behind it, collate, as it says there, review, analyze data collected through the Stop Traffic server, which will the IBM servers, photographs, geotagged. And we believe, simply because of the work we're doing with law enforcement agencies around the world, that this will, I'm sorry, this jumped on again, let me go back. This information will be helpful in terms of informing legislation, policy, law enforcement, intelligence. It will help with regulation. It will help with rescue. It will provide, as some of the other speakers have talked about, information which is very helpful for wise and accurate decision making. It will provide a mapping tool. It will provide digital intelligence. And just move on to the next slide, which is my last slide. I think I've taken my 10 minutes just. The user experience, it's being alpha and beta tested at the moment, will be smooth and seamless. Specific data will be collected through the app. Users will be asked to provide who you observed, what you observed, when you observed it, where you observed it, and the details of their observation. They'll even be able to upload photographs and video as well. And we're working, as I say, at the moment with several large law enforcement agencies around the world who've all contributed to the development of this tool and are contributing to the ways in which this information will be analyzed and then will be made available to different stakeholders, to law enforcement groups who are already bought into it, to NGOs, et cetera, around the world. I think one of the previous speakers said, and with this I close, that the problem is that we just don't share information. Of course, traffickers share information. We don't share our information, it was suggested, because of lack of cooperation. I think it's something deeper than that. I think it's that most people just do rules, and most people are unable to break away from the regulations that surround them in their agency. What we need is a proactive, global, joined-up approach that actually creates an environment where if we're fighting a global crime together, we share information globally and freely with each other. I think that's a challenge facing us as we move ahead. So lastly to say, well, that's it. That's what Stop the Traffic is. It's a huge network of thousands of charities, NGOs, all committed to stopping the traffic. And Stop Traffic's part in that, as a voluntary agency, is prevention rather than rescue. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Steve, and thank you to all our presenters for these exciting and insightful presentations. I think we've gotten a really nice overview of the scope of the problem, the range of the challenges, how it feels and is experienced by the individuals who are victims of this situation, a number of tools and resources that are available for the private sector, for companies in terms of trying to address it, and also strategies and tools available for the activist network and the NGO network. So I think it's been a really good sort of framing of the larger issue. I know subsequent webinars in this series are going to delve more deeply into specific aspects of these challenges, but this has been a great kickoff, and I want to thank you all. I also want to encourage our audience to chat in some questions. We're still waiting for those. I know people get engaged with listening and they're not thinking about writing their questions, but please do so. And in the meantime, Christina and I will share a few of the questions that occurred to us as we were listening to these presentations. I think what I'd like to do to start, since this is in fact a webinar that's focused on the role of the private sector, is to ask each of you to maybe talk a little bit about, you know, if you could wave a wand, you know, what do you want to see private sector companies doing? I heard many different examples during the course of these presentations. You know, we heard about partnerships with companies that were helping to develop these apps to gather information. We heard about Apple's initiatives around restricting the recruitment fees. But obviously, you know, one knows, one assumes that many of the private sector companies are in fact quite aware of these practices. So what I'd like to know is, you know, what you would ideally like to see private sector companies do, and think about it both at the level of multinationals, publicly held, but also a broader range of companies, and how you think they might be incentivized to do that. So I would open that question for all of our speakers, Ilias, Quinn, and Steve. Can we have their voices unmuted so they can jump in? You're all unmuted. So would you like to jump in? I guess first taker gets the floor.
Thanks. It's Ilias. Hi again. I think that one of the things that I would like to see is more self-regulation, especially at the global level, especially for companies that go beyond the reach of any particular sort of authority. But then also I would like to see more regulation where it's necessary at the local level. And I would be very interested to hear also from Quinn discuss one of the questions that I had with regard to how was the legislative measures in California have been received by the business community there, what has been the impact, what has been the the feedback, the compliance, and so on. So for myself, as I said, self-regulation at the big companies, and more regulation where it's necessary at the local level. Thank you.
Ilias, thank you. Before we get Quinn's response to your question, which I would like to hear as well, could you just say a minute, is there an example of this kind of self-regulation in, I know there are industries that have tried to do certain things, but is there an example that you think is a good model?
I don't know if it's a good model, and because I'm not sure how it works and if it's efficient. But the example I think Quinn mentioned with regard to Apple and its practices along the supply chain is an example that can be discussed. And we have other examples of recruitment companies that try to waive totally fees for the recruitment of employees. What is the what is the impact of this type of practice in the businesses? And what has been how it has been received.
Thank you, Ilias. Quinn, could you comment a bit about the question that Ilias raised about Apple? And I guess I would add, what do you think are the motivators, the pressure points that actually led to that kind of a response? When I think of self-regulation, I often think of it as being industry associations where folks kind of band together because they want to level the playing field. They don't want to get out in front to be the ones to bear the price or the cost of these kinds of activities. But it sounds like Apple did. So can you talk a little about that?
Sure. So it's interesting, throughout the years, seeing the companies that have started to take action. So it's interesting also, speaking of reputational damage, how sort of the reputational damage really follows companies for years and years. And when people still think of Apple, they think of them as being sort of behind the curve, whereas we've seen more and more that they've been ahead of the curve and really pushing the whole industry forward in many cases. And there's been other companies, of course, in the electronics industry that have also taken positive steps. But I think in a lot of times it is in reaction to cases that come out into the public, right? And I think that it's that one of the things I'd really like to see companies do is to get ahead of the curve and be able to put practices in place that will prevent these practices. Steve mentioned, I think prevention is huge, right? Rather than having to respond to them when the damage is already done. And so, I think it's also really important for companies to look further down their supply chains, right? And so a lot of the initiatives now are focused on the first-tier suppliers. So whether that's the electronics factories or the people who are actually making gold jewelry, but not looking at, there's been some focus on cotton, but not looking at, where those, whether it's extractive industries or agriculture, and we've really been pushing that as well. And then I think Ilias also mentioned the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. That has had some positive effects, and we've been monitoring with the TESS, the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, the compliance with the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, and the number of companies that have actually put up their policies on trafficking. And so more and more companies are putting their policies online, but again, enforcement and government enforcement, whether that's in the U.S. or in other countries, is also really important. And encouraging cooperation between the private and public sectors is also something that I think aids both parties in ensuring that compliance happens. And so if Apple is reporting some of those violations to government officials, or we're able to create databases with information on bad labor broker practices and provide those to government officials, then that strengthens their capacity. And likewise, if government officials do their job and really carry out inspections, that will also aid the companies in ensuring that the conditions in factories are decent.
Thanks, Quinn. Thank you, Quinn. Just quickly on the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act example, was that a situation where the private sector, the companies, fought it till it was a reality, or were there private sector players who actually got behind it because they saw it as a way of sort of making sure everyone complied with the same guidelines?
Right. It really depends upon the company. And so, you know, there were two sides to it, and that's generally how it happens. There's some companies that really, you know, do put in place best practices and are really thought leaders, where there are others that fight it. And again, having, you know, a big company having better regulations of their suppliers, because again, over $100 million in revenue, which is the cutoff line for the California Transparency Supply Chains Act, is actually a relatively small company that could be operating. And so if a company, a large company, can ensure that their suppliers are in compliance, for example, that saves them a lot of work as well. And so, you know, it is really a positive thing for companies once they decide to get behind it, to take those kinds of actions. And also, you know, sometimes companies sort of looking at a certain sector or country can have really big impacts. And so we actually worked with Philip Morris in Kazakhstan, for example, looking at the tobacco supply chain. And they put in place programs across the country. They have 1.5 million suppliers on an international level, but working with numerous suppliers in Kazakhstan. It was actually one of the two countries that got taken off the DOL list of goods produced with forced and child labor. I think that was in 2013. I think it was last year. And so sometimes having, you know, really putting efforts behind a certain initiative can have a dramatic impact in certain countries.
Yeah.
Right.
It's Steve here. If I could say that I think following what's happened in California, UK government at the moment is looking at something which is called the Modern Slavery Bill, and this is going through Parliament and will go through will complete its course in the next few months, probably early next year. The contentious point at the moment is the reporting of supply chains, and there's been enormous pressure from a huge number of voluntary bodies across the country involved with the issue of trafficking to think about supply chains. But there's been massive resistance to that from government. And as we speak, this is a live issue. And the government seems to be oscillating one way or the other. They like the idea of creating what they say will be a world-class slavery act, which will make trafficking harder here, this goes to the rhetoric, than in most other countries around the world. But in the end, what we say to them constantly is this hangs around whether the supply chain piece and the reporting of policies goes into the legislation or not. What worries them is that they're, you know, Britain's recovering from recession, businesses doing better. If we make life difficult for our major businesses by them having to say the cotton in our shirts or in our suits, as there's been trafficking or forced labor involved in the supply of that cotton, if they have to track that and confess that, then in actual fact you put British business back. That's how the argument goes, the counter lobby. So this is being fought through at the moment. We believe that every company in the UK should have to report annually as part of its annual reporting to its shareholders and to the public on its supply chain. And every company should have an officer responsible for looking at the cleanliness of that supply chain, just as you would do for looking at safeguarding issues, other safeguarding issues. So that's where we are at the moment with this. A little bit of good practice to report back. I said that I was in New York with Citibank. Part of Stop the Traffic is we run a group which is called FAT, Finance Against Trafficking, and it's really talking with banks constantly about how they track the bank account of a trafficker. How do you recognize this? What characteristics does it have? And what do you do about anti-money laundering legislation and policy? Because the Citibank group, they came and had a seminar, a workshop with me, and invited me back to New York to speak to the key executives globally. They tell me they're in 160 countries, and they want to, as we just heard, They want to become a field leader here. So I think they've had probably a tough time and pressure put on them from the American government in the past, besides others. But there is a real desire to become a market leader in thinking through anti-money laundering legislation that detects a trafficker's bank account.
Yeah, and I would assume that the apps that you're working on are intended as a tool toward that, toward the implementation, toward that end, yes?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, at the end of the day, is that if the information we've got, you know, we can be impressed by the numbers we produce, but if the information's wrong or not reliable, we're never going to get anywhere. And,
right.
and to your point, I think that the corporates that we're working with, some very large ones around the world, those that, as we've heard, want to be thought leaders in this, need good information. And actually, they don't trust a lot of our information because they keep hearing the same numbers in so many contexts repeated. You know, how many times can we say that traffickers earned $32 billion last year profit? Yeah, how many times can we say that? How come they always earn $32 billion profit every year, and it's always last year? No one believes it, but it keeps on being said.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, Christina, you had a question you wanted to share?
I did. I have another broader question, and this can go to any of the panelists. Thank you again for your extraordinary work and your presentation. And again, this question can go to any of the presenters. When you were approaching corporations and beginning that conversation, I know that we've been talking with those of us in the communities that's working on illicit trades, fighting organized crime. How do you create that safe space for conversation? And Quinn, I know you had talked in your presentation about the reputational issues, the fear of litigation. How do you create that traction? And was there someone within the corporation, whether it was through, one specific position, and it could be a CSR officer, it could be from another stakeholder within the company, was it through consumer and a combination of factors that helped your initial conversation get traction? And I'm really interested in hearing your experiences because each of you are working with a number of different initiatives in corporations globally, and would love to hear your thoughts. And this is for anyone again.
Yeah, so this is Quinn. Basically, Verite has a long track record working with companies, and we do a lot of auditing and assessments for companies in their supply chains. And so we really gain the confidence of companies that we're not going to take that confidential information and share it with the world. And also, we've taken a stance in our reports that rather than randomly highlighting a certain company that might be involved in the supply chain, we've seen this a lot of times in articles. So there will be a problem electronics factory, and there may be 10 electronics companies sourcing from that factory, but a lot of times one of those companies will just be sort of randomly highlighted. And it's generally the same names that get tossed around over and over again. And so rather than doing that, we like to say, well, any company that's sourcing from electronics from X country, and so we put out a big report on Malaysian electronics, for example, finding that as a minimum estimate, about a third of workers that we interviewed were in forced labor in the Malaysian electronics industry. And rather than just randomly choosing a company and trying to engage in shaming, we stated, any company sourcing electronics from Malaysia really is at a high risk of having forced labor in their supply chains. And so that really generates much wider action, and instead of companies being defensive and reactive, it helps them to all realize they're in the same position, right? And then, also we've been working on stuff such as the research on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Kingpin and especially designated nationals list that can really have financial and penal sanctions really imposed on high-level executives. And so one of the issues is that a lot of times CSR folks within companies do not have as much leverage as other departments. And so looking at other types of laws that might not specifically be related to trafficking, but really contribute to the same structural factors that contribute to trafficking, is very effective. And so you really get the attention when you bring up the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, because there's departments dealing with it, lawyers on staff, and a lot of companies don't realize that they have this risk. And again, the same, these corrupt practices, if they can address them in their supply chains and in their recruitment supply chains, they can really address the risk of trafficking as well. And the same goes for these, for involvement with organized crime entities. And again, that's another way to combat organized crime, is by cutting down on their revenue and their finances. So I think that that all of that helps to get companies to engage, and then also the type of the field research that we do, and sort of raising awareness about different issues that might not have been brought into the public light is very important as well. So when you do that kind of research on the Malaysian electronics factories, or the research we've done in gold in Peru, or on forced labor and coffee in Guatemala, you know, companies actually contact us afterwards and say, we didn't know we had this risk, and you know, we're worried about this and want to figure out how to address it. And then also having, you know, really practical tools and steps that companies can implement, rather than just raising the alarm and sounding alarm bells. It's you know, providing companies with concrete steps that they can implement, and making it a manageable problem, rather than just calling them out.
If I may add to that, because I think both Quinn and Steve made, you know, quite interesting references. And I want to pick one thing that Quinn mentioned towards the end of his intervention on the penal sanctions. And I think this is an important element, because prevention is something that, you know, the private sector can do very well. But at the same time, there needs to be an arsenal of measures that you can use, and member states can use, for those that, you know, follow practices that, you know, fall into this category of the crime. And in the Palermo Convention, there is an article which asks for the liability of legal persons for crimes committed there under the Palermo Convention and its protocols. And this is a very important tool to use. This is what we always advise governments on when they're developing legislation. At the same time, you ask for what is the entry point for discussion with the private sector. And for us, is basically the fact that we do represent 193 member states. So it's the weight of the UN, which makes us also extremely thorough when screening are the companies that we work with in a number of initiatives. And I think this is both a quite powerful tool from our side, because lending our name can have, you know, adds a lot of visibility and a lot of credibility to any initiative, but at the same time also creates a lot of responsibilities to make sure that we do a lot of due diligence when we're working with the private sector. The work that Steve mentioned with Citibank, I think, is extremely important, because it shows the wide range of things that the private sector can do in helping combat this awful crime. And, you know, tracing the money is a very important element, because in my experience also as a practitioner, people are willing to go to prison as long as they know they will have the money when they get out. And taking the money away is a very important part of both preventing and also combating this crime. Thank you.
Right. Steve, do you want to add anything to that one?
Very little, because I think Ilias said it so well. The way I always say it to audiences, I said it to Citibank executives when I was there with them the other week. All we have to do, actually, when you say, can we end human trafficking, it sounds such a huge thing to achieve, such an impossible task. But when you put it as Ilias has just done, it becomes a lot easier, because no one gets out of bed to traffic people. They get out of bed to make money, and they get out of bed to make money as easily as possible. So they make money out of trafficking humans because at the moment it's very easy. The rewards of trafficking people are very high, which is why human trafficking is becoming, is increasing as a crime, as we know. You know, the second biggest crime in the world, we estimate. It's because it's very easy to make money out of it, but the risk of being detected or punished, even if you are detected, is very low. So the rewards are high and the risks are low. As we work with the finance sector around the world, as we work to put legislation in place in countries that control supply chains or monitor supply chains, what actually happens is the rewards of trafficking come down and the risks go higher. And because the traffickers motivated, I mean, you know, people aren't people traffickers, are they? They're just criminals. And they'll make money by trafficking drugs and guns and people and anything else they can lay their hands on. So if we make it tougher and tougher and tougher, in the end, this guy gets out of bed and goes, "It's too much risk, too much work. I'm going to do something else."
Mm.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And that actually sets up the next question I wanted to ask, which is, and again, it's useful for all three of you, I think, to address, which is, how do you measure your impact? You're each working in slightly different ways with slightly different groups of stakeholders using different mechanisms. And you each talked at some point or another about measuring the size and scope of the challenge. Steve talked about we need better information there because we keep using the same numbers. But I'm curious about how you try and measure your impact, and in particular, when you talk about, you know, the rewards going down and the risks going up for the perpetrators of this kind of activity, I'm also interested in the rewards going up and the risks going down for those who are trying to address this or prevent it. So if you all could kind of comment in that general area about how you're assessing your progress, that would be great. And anyone can start. Should I call on with you?
Sure. So yeah, I'll start.
Thanks.
Yeah. So basically, you know, again, some of what happens behind the scenes with Verite, with companies, sometimes it's hard to publicize.
Right.
But generally, the types of commitments, the amount of money in recruitment fees that's returned to workers, the steps that suppliers are taking, you know, again, companies represent a very important leverage point because, you know, especially if you can get a coalition of companies behind something, that they have a lot of leverage over their suppliers. It depends upon the industry, but in many cases, a big company, and especially if you get three of the big companies in a sector together, will have a lot of leverage over the suppliers, right? And they can pressure their suppliers to carry out certain practices such as no-fee recruitment, ensuring that that workers who are brought in aren't charged recruitment fees, that their passports aren't withheld, that the brokers that they're working with are reputable. Those types of steps are really important. And then also, you know, something that is public is having companies come out and make public statements and putting in place policies that will prevent trafficking in their supply chains. And I'd say one roadblock to that is that there have been certain companies that have come out and been transparent about cases of child or forced labor that they've found in their supply chains, or cases of other labor violations. And in many cases, you know, the press picks up on that and reports it as a negative story rather than a positive story. And I think there's a need to change that to recognize companies for being transparent and for admitting to the scale of problems. And that's both on a country and company level. You know, there's also certain countries we work with, and the governments have been very candid about the scale of forced labor, and that's much more positive than just denial. And so, you know, I think that's a big first step as well.
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
Ilya, Steve, do you guys want to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks. For us, it's a little bit more different and difficult in the sense that we have a global reach, which makes it very difficult to measure the impact on that scale. And I just want to start with the remark that human trafficking is global as a crime, but at the same time, responses are local, and that's where the biggest impact is. At the local level and at the regional level. That's where you should be measuring your impact. Because at the global level, you're kind of losing the perspective because of the size of the problem. You know, the billions of dollars that Steve mentioned, you know, the millions of human trafficking victims that are referred to us the victims of that crime, which I think are only the tip of the iceberg, and we all kind of agree with that. We may have different opinions of what is the level of how many victims are out there, but we know that what we know is only the tip of the iceberg. So I think, you know, the impact for us is measured more locally and regionally. And how do we measure it? I mean, in the context that we're discussing today, is for me the increased interest that the private sector shows in working with us, in reaching out to us to work with them, which was not there a couple of years ago. Which shows that there is more awareness in the private sector on the need to deal with the crime, but at the same time to have a clean record, you know, for their clients. I need to mention here that at one point that Quinn mentioned, which is the role of the media, which at the same time is a mixed blessing. On the one hand, it raises, you know, issues, you know, very, very high, and then because of another calamity that happens somewhere in the world, forgets the same issues for a long period of time until something very dramatic happens again. But still, it's a motivating factor for especially the private sector, especially the big companies. So the interest that the private sector shows in working with us is in my view, a way to measure an impact. At the other level, at the level of cooperation more with our member states, is the cooperation we have to. The more effective cooperation that member states have between themselves in working to deal with this crime. And we all know that this is a crime that will be very, very difficult to erase from the face of the earth. And the only thing that we can do is continue working to try to address its various forms, because it keeps also mutating as you know, with the time. So for me, just to summarize, I think it's, you know, the impact should be measured locally and regionally, and in that context, it's, especially with regard to the private sector, it's the interest of the private sector to work with us on certain initiatives that could have hopefully a positive impact. Thank you.
Thanks, Julius. Steve, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, just again briefly to add, not to take away from anything that's been said, all of that I agree with wholeheartedly. I think again, my point to add would be, in the end, why do businesses sit up and take notice? How do they find their moral compass? They're governed by shareholders. The shareholders want the biggest amount of return. So if you take the example of Cadbury's chocolate in the UK and in Australia and elsewhere, why did they turn their best brand traffic free? Which is effectively what they've done by making it fairly traded. They tried to get away with it for as long as possible. I went to see the managing director of Cadbury's on several occasions. He told me that they would never break ranks with the other chocolate producers, chocolate manufacturers, and that there was nothing that could be done. Everybody knew that there was a trafficking and forced labour problem in Côte d'Ivoire, and it was beyond Cadbury's ability to do anything about. We launched a campaign through schools in Australia and in the UK most effectively, but elsewhere, which got huge media coverage, in newspapers, but also television coverage. Somebody wrote a play, and the play was put on in central London. People wrote songs. One song entered the UK charts, which was an amazing thing. And surprise, surprise, one evening, the managing director of Cadbury's emailed me, and he said, "You'll be very pleased to hear that tomorrow morning we're going to announce that our central brand will be fairly traded from now on." So I think that in a market-driven economy, the consumer is always king. Therefore, there are thought-leading corporates people in the private sector who will want to take this step, normally because they've been educated, they've been inspired, they've come across a champion. But then there are other companies who will take this step in the end because they want to protect their shareholders' income. And once they realise they can't get away with it, to keep the public on side, they will make that move. And I think that happens time and time again, which means that our work down at the grassroots, working with ordinary communities so that they become aware of trafficking and some of the abuse around it, I think that's very important to our battle going forward.
That's a great example. Those are great examples. Thanks, Steve. Can I ask, I was curious, how large a role, given what you were just saying, how large a role does the investment community play in this? I mean, we all know about the social investment community. It's grown a lot, but it's still a small part of the larger investment community. I'm just curious how extensively any of you find that you're working with them, or that has an impact for good or ill on your work. Right.
Yeah. So yeah, this is Quinn again. So I think that the points that both Ilias and Steve brought up were very important. So there's a couple of things that we've done, and I think there's one really good case. And I sort of mentioned that Verite doesn't name names, and I think that a lot of times there's the need for a good cop and a bad cop. There's a need for activist organizations that do name names, right? Because otherwise, a lot of times there isn't the impetus to carry out action. And also the stakeholder action has been really important. So given, for example, the Philip Morris case, it was actually initiated by an ICCR shareholder action, right? Interface Center on Corporate Responsibility shareholder action. And then by some work by Human Rights Watch that really pushed them to take on this issue of forced labor and child labor in supply chains. And basically now it's really, one thing that we've seen with some companies that we work with is that once they take this on, it becomes a source of pride, for the company, and it starts to develop a real culture, right? You start hiring people who come from the field of corporate social responsibility or trafficking, and then it really starts to change the culture of companies. And so, in that case, it was really shareholder action that started to push companies to do the right thing. And I think also on a country level, also there are different investment and SRI programs that can start to push countries to the right into the right practices. So, for example, the Emerging Markets Research Program that you mentioned that we carry out is carried out in 25 countries for the New York City Employees Retirement System. We've also done similar work for CalPERS, which is the California Public Employees Retirement System. And so CalPERS is over $100 billion, and NYSERS is over $30 billion worth of investment. And basically, we assess labor conditions in different countries, including on forced labor trafficking and foreign contract labor. And basically, countries either can qualify or disqualified for investment based upon labor law and enforcement. And so, again, this is a good way to also push governments into carrying out the right types of enforcement actions and to pass the laws that protect workers.
Thanks, Quinn. Do Ilias or Steve, do you want to comment on that question?
I think that's maybe more for Steve, because for me, because especially of our role, it's a little bit difficult to answer that question.
Right, I understand. Steve, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think that what Quinn said, I think is enough for us to chew on.
Okay. Well, let me move to kind of a question which I hope we can kind of move to concluding with, which is, it's really been very generous of the three of you to share your huge insights and your experiences and some of these really compelling stories with us today. I guess I was thinking this is your opportunity to share a message with our audience on the webinar today, and also those who will listen to this recording later, to be thinking about, what would you like the impact of this conversation we've had today to be? What kinds of actions or responses might you hope for? And I'll ask you, when you each respond to that, to be thinking about different audiences. Some of our audiences today are activists. Some of them are individual consumers or individual investors. Some of them are, in fact, representatives of their companies. And some of them are business educators. And so if you could think about what ideally, what makes this worth your time to share with us in this generous way today. So I guess I'll ask to go in the order that we presented today, and maybe ask Ilias to respond first.
Thank you very much, and again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of the panel today. For me, it's a very important discussion, because this is also something that, from our side, from our organizational side, I think we could do more in the sense of, realizing more what the private sector could do, and especially in developing preventive strategies and having an impact on our overall efforts. The message that I would have for the audience and for us also as panelists is that, and as UNODC, is also that governments would need also to realize the same thing, because sometimes governments think only about what they could do, about law enforcement, about preventive charges that they could launch, and then they forget that the private sector itself could have a significant impact in these efforts. So this is a message that I think has two recipients, both ourselves as well as the governments of the member states that we're working with. Thank you.
Thank you. Quinn?
Right. Yes. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak here in this panel. And and again, I think that moving forward, I would love to see more companies take on these types of actions. And I think it's really important to work with all the stakeholders who are here. I think that each one of us, brings different things to the table. Whether it's the UN ODC and their global reach, and being really the organization that's responsible for the Palermo Protocol, or whether it's the Even Stop the Traffic and their programs with finance, which I think are incredibly important, or Verite and the types of practical tools that we have that companies can put in place. I'd love to see companies work with all these different stakeholders, and also us as stakeholders to continue to work together more to move things forward.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I wanted to encourage all of our listeners to check out all the websites that were mentioned today. There are tools, there are resources, there's the toolkit you just mentioned. So I'm glad you reminded me. So Steve, do you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I think the thing that motivates me, why am I passionate about giving my time to this, why am I excited to be part of this webinar today? I'm here because I want to learn. I'm here because I have learned this afternoon. I've made lots and lots of notes. I'm here because I am personally passionate that every single life is of infinite value. Every single life counts. And I struggle with the concept that in the 21st century, with all of our instant sophistication, I sit in front of me now, I've got a laptop in front of me, an iPhone, and an iPad. I can talk at this very moment to almost anyone in the world. I can talk to almost anyone in the world free, which is an extraordinary thing. I can talk to them and I can watch them. Now, I know that many people still don't have access to digital technology, but in a world where we're that connected up, I believe, I agree with Ilias, I agree with Quinn, we can be and we must be doing more to get joined up. So I think the private sector, which is what we focused on this afternoon, government, as Ilias says, the law enforcement agencies, and the voluntary sector need to get more joined up. I fear that it's our own competitiveness with one another that holds us back all of the time. And it's the protocols that have been developed, for good reason in the past that hold us back. I've just written a book about something else, but I say that a map maker's life is a terrible thing. Because if you're a map maker, if you draw maps for a living, the one thing you can be sure of is that by the time your map is published, it is out of date. It's always out of date. They changed the layout of the roads. They've put up some one-way signs. They've built some new buildings, et cetera, et cetera. Maps are always out of date. I think rules laws, regulation, is always out of date, because what we actually do is we map the past and we create regulation and parameters and protocols because they're the best expression of our experience of the past. But traffickers are ahead of us in a global way, and they don't obey the protocols and they don't keep the rules. So we, rather than being hemmed in by our maps of the past, we have to think in fresh ways about how we get joined up across all sectors for the future, or we will not end this.
Thanks, Steve. That's actually a lovely sort of conclusion and also a lovely transition to what I wanted to share at the end here. I mean, you pointed out that laws and rules and regulations are lagging indicators. I think that's absolutely true. And one of the reasons, I mean, I've learned a lot this morning or this afternoon from this really rich conversation. I want to thank you all who participated in it. And, you know, one of the reasons why it's really interesting to me is because of the work I do with Giving Voice to Values, which is actually trying to collect stories and design curriculum and pedagogy to involve people in actually proactively changing behaviors in companies that need to be changed. And so I think actually we've learned a lot from this conversation about what that might be. We're all grateful for your time, Ilias, Quinn, and Steve. You guys contributed so much. We're grateful for our audience's interest in the topic. And I want to also invite you all to participate in our next webinar in this series, which is going to take place on Friday, December 12th. 2014 at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the topic is going to be the new American dream, ? Illicit migration, human trafficking, and smuggling in the Americas. So I think that'll be a really nice building on today's conversation and hopefully deepening of it. So we hope you'll mark your calendars for December 12th. 10 a.m. We wish you each a wonderful rest of your day or evening, and we look forward to the next conversation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.